That morning felt so normal at first. I was locking my car, balancing my coffee, already rehearsing the list of things I needed to handle at work. The sun was warm on my shoulders, just enough to make the day feel predictable. Then I heard Mrs. Dawson's cheerful voice floating over the hedge, the kind of friendly sound that usually makes me smile without thinking. I turned toward her, expecting nothing more than small talk. But the moment she opened her mouth, something in me braced, though I didn't know why yet. "Jessica, you must be so proud of your husband," she said, and I let out a polite laugh, even though pride wasn't exactly something I associated with Eric anymore. If anything, I'd been carrying silent exhaustion for months, the kind of heaviness you pretend isn't there. Still, I played along, like women do when they've learned to hide hurt behind grace. "Oh? Why's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Mrs. Dawson's eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm, and right then, a tiny pinch of unease tightened in my chest. "Seeing him help so many women warms my heart," she continued, and I felt my breath hitch, just slightly. I tried to hold my smile steady, even as something inside me started to twist. Then she said it, the word that changed everything. "He must be a wonderful therapist." Therapist. It landed like a cold drop of water down my spine. I stood there, pretending to understand, pretending everything made sense. While inside, questions began rising like a tide I couldn't hold back. I managed to choke out a smile, the kind that feels glued to your face while your mind runs in circles. "Therapist," I repeated, hoping she'd correct herself, give me some harmless explanation to cling to. But Mrs. Dawson just nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware of the storm she had just triggered. She mentioned a new sign on my gate, something about sessions in progress, and my heart dropped into my stomach. I hadn't seen any sign. I hadn't approved anything. My husband didn't even have a job, let alone a profession. I forced a laugh, the kind that comes out thin and shaky, like a piece of glass about to crack. Yes. "Sessions," I said, pretending it was all perfectly normal, perfectly fine. She kept talking, but her voice felt distant, muffled by the pounding in my ears. I nodded along to be polite, but my thoughts were already spiraling. "Every day," she said. "A different woman every day." I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried not to let her see my hands tremble, but inside, something was unraveling fast. I slipped into my car as soon as I could, shutting the door with a little more force than necessary. The moment the lock clicked, my smile fell away, leaving only confusion and a sudden sharp fear I couldn't quite name. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cold leather press into my palms. "Sessions in progress." The words echoed in my head like a warning. I stared at my own house through the windshield, wondering what on earth was happening behind that front door. And somewhere inside me, a decision was already beginning to take shape. As I sat there in the car, the air suddenly felt too thick, like I couldn't get a full breath. I replayed every moment from the past few weeks, the late nights, the vague excuses, the way he brushed off simple questions. At the time, I told myself he was just stressed, maybe embarrassed about still being unemployed. But now those little moments felt like puzzle pieces snapping into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, feeling a sting behind my eyes. Something was wrong, and it was happening in my house. My mind drifted back to our early years, when Eric was full of big ideas and promises. I used to believe in them, in him, the way you believe in a fire that keeps you warm. But over time, that fire faded, leaving nothing but smoke and excuses. I carried us financially, emotionally, silently, hoping he'd eventually find his footing. And now here I was, learning from my neighbor that he'd apparently found a calling I never knew about. It wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was humiliation, the kind that burrows deep under your skin. I straightened up, wiping my palms on my skirt, forcing myself to breathe. If there was one thing I'd learned in life, it was that the truth has a way of revealing itself, often when we least expect it. And whether I liked it or not, the truth was tugging at me now, demanding to be seen. I took one last look at the house, the blinds half closed, the silence suspiciously still, and a cold certainty washed over me. I had to go back, not later, not tonight, now. And as I put the car in reverse, I felt the first spark of something fierce awakening inside me. I drove back toward the house, pretending I'd forgotten something, though we both know that wasn't true. My pulse hammered the entire way, each beat louder than the last, like my body already knew what my mind refused to admit. As I turned onto my street, the first thing I noticed was the unfamiliar red car parked in front of my house. Shiny, spotless, and absolutely not ours. My stomach tightened. I slowed down, staring at it as if it might blink back at me. Every instinct in my body whispered the same thing. I wasn't meant to see this. I parked a few houses away, not wanting anyone to notice I'd returned. The air felt colder than it had 10 minutes earlier, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and settles there. Walking up the driveway, I moved slowly, deliberately, listening for anything. A voice, a laugh, a clue. The blinds were half closed, just like they had been that morning, but now they looked intentional, like someone was hiding inside. I swallowed hard. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding, but deep down, I already knew better. I slipped the key into the lock as quietly as I could, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. And there it was, the sound that shattered every fragile hope I'd tried to hold on to. Soft laughter. A woman's laughter. It floated through the hallway like perfume, light and intimate, the kind of sound you make when someone is trying to impress you. My breath caught. I pressed my back against the wall, heart racing, skin buzzing with a mixture of dread and clarity. And with each step I took closer to the living room, I felt the last remnants of my denial fall away. I leaned closer to the doorway, barely peeking through the narrow gap, and what I saw hit me like a punch to the chest. Eric was sitting on the couch, his shirt half open, looking far too comfortable for a man who claimed he'd been working on new business ideas. And next to him sat a woman I'd never seen before, legs crossed, heels on, silk blouse clinging to her like she'd dressed for anything but therapy. She laughed again, lightly touching his arm, and I felt something inside me go still. Not angry, not shocked, just numb, the kind of numbness that's almost more painful than rage. "You really do have a gift for making people relax," she said, her voice soft, teasing. And Eric, my husband, leaned back like he'd earned the compliment. "Well, therapy's all about connection," he replied, his tone smug enough to curdle blood. Connection. The word snapped something in me. I stepped forward, no longer caring about being quiet or polite or composed. My foot hit the edge of the rug, and both their heads whipped toward me. For a split second, no one breathed. I could almost hear the moment their world tilted the way mine had earlier that morning. "Oh, apparently it's also about a lack of clothes?" I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. The woman jolted upright, scrambling for her purse, eyes wide like a child caught stealing candy. Eric's face drained of color as if someone had unplugged him. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, shutting him down before he could even try to manipulate the narrative. The woman rushed past me, heels clicking across the floor like gunshots, leaving behind perfume and panic. And suddenly, it was just the two of us. Him standing, me staring, and the truth hanging in the air like smoke. Eric started sputtering excuses immediately, the kind of desperate rambling you hear from someone who thinks talking fast enough might rewrite reality. "Jessica, it's not what it looks like," he began, and I almost laughed. Not out of humor, but disbelief, the kind that comes when someone insults your intelligence on top of your heart. I walked past him slowly, deliberately, like I needed to see the room for myself. The wine glasses, the half-open shirt, the familiar smugness fading from his face, it looked exactly like what it was, and he knew it. I moved to the kitchen counter, my hand steadier than I expected, and picked up the stack of receipts I'd noticed the night before. Gas stations, cheap hotels, bottles of wine that never made it home. I tossed them toward him, letting them scatter like confetti from a party he'd thrown behind my back. "Gas, wine, hotel rooms," I said. "You should have added therapeutic supplies to your expense list." He had the audacity to look wounded, as if he was the one betrayed. "I was lonely," he mumbled. "You're always working." And there it was, the excuse I'd carried for him for years, now turned like a knife. I stared at him, feeling a calm so sharp it could cut glass. "I was paying for this roof," I said softly. "And apparently for your dating service." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The silence between us felt heavy, thick, like a room filled with fog you couldn't breathe through. And yet, beneath all that heaviness, I felt something shift. A clarity. A plan forming in the shadows of my mind. I didn't know the full picture yet, but I knew there was more. More lies, more women, more to uncover. And later that night, I would open his laptop and see just how deep it all went. That night, sleep didn't just avoid me. It felt impossible, like my body refused to shut down while my mind screamed for answers. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day until the truth felt too loud to ignore. Finally, I got up, the floor cool beneath my feet as I walked toward his laptop sitting on the desk. He'd never been careful. He never thought he had to be. And with one click, the screen lit up, illuminating the room and revealing more than I was ready for. A part of me still hoped I'd find nothing, but deep down, I knew better. His inbox was a disaster of deception, hundreds of emails, neatly organized into folders he probably thought made him look professional. But to me, they were a roadmap of betrayal. Subject lines hit me like punches. "Thanks for today's session. You really helped me. About our next appointment." Each one from a different woman. Each one thinking she had found someone who understood her. I opened the first email, then the next, and the next, my heartbeat quickening with every message. He had built an entire identity, not just lies, but a false profession, a fantasy version of himself. Scrolling through the threads, I realized something even more horrifying. Every single woman believed she was special to him. He'd sold them the same dream he once sold me. Attention dressed as care, validation disguised as empathy. I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and heavy, but underneath it was something colder. A resolve. A clarity that steadied me. I started taking screenshots, saving everything, printing what I could. Page after page, lie after lie. And as the evidence piled up beside me, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. He had no idea who he had just betrayed. The more I read, the deeper the pit in my stomach grew. These weren't just flirtations or careless mistakes. They were patterns, routines, rehearsed lines he'd delivered with the confidence of someone who thought he'd never be caught. I found emails where he offered private emotional breakthroughs, invitations to safe, intimate environments, and even suggested extended sessions for women who seemed particularly vulnerable. Every sentence felt like peeling back another layer of a man I realized I'd never truly known. And the worst part? He sounded proud of it. Proud of the manipulation, proud of the attention, proud of the performance. At some point, my legs gave out, and I sank into the desk chair, the weight of everything pressing down on my chest. I remembered the early days of our marriage, when he talked about wanting to help people, to make a difference. Back then, I believed it came from a sincere place. Seeing these messages now, I understood that he wasn't helping anyone. He was feeding off them, using their pain to stroke his ego. I felt a deep ache, not for him, but for the version of myself who once trusted him so blindly. For the woman who worked overtime so he could find his purpose. I rubbed my hands together trying to warm myself, but the cold I felt wasn't on my skin. It was inside me. Sharp, focused, awakening. I gathered the printed pages, stacking them neatly, methodically, like building blocks of truth. Evidence didn't lie. Screenshots didn't twist stories. And for the first time in a long while, I felt powerful, not spiteful, purposeful. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to break anything. I wanted justice, real consequences, the kind of accountability he'd never had to face before. And somewhere between those emails and that growing stack of proof, a plan began taking shape with crystal clarity. By the time I reached the last folder, my hands had stopped shaking. I wasn't overwhelmed anymore. I was focused, almost eerily calm, the way you feel right before making a decision that changes everything. I clicked on a final message, one where he referred to himself as a licensed trauma specialist. The lie was so bold, so reckless, I actually let out a breathy, humorless laugh. He hadn't just cheated on me. He'd built an entire fake career on the backs of vulnerable women, and he'd done it under my roof, with my Wi-Fi, using the safety of the home I paid for. I pushed the laptop back and stood slowly, stretching my spine as if shaking off the version of myself who tolerated excuses, and lowered standards. The printer hummed behind me, spitting out page after damning page, filling the room with a rhythmic certainty that felt almost ceremonial. I gathered everything: the emails, the receipts, the hotel confirmations, the fake documents, and placed them into a sleek black folder. Something about the act felt symbolic, like I was packaging not just evidence, but the end of a chapter I'd held onto for far too long. And when I looked at that folder, I didn't see betrayal anymore. I saw leverage. I pressed my palms on the desk, grounding myself, letting the silence settle. Revenge wasn't the right word for what I wanted. It was too small, too emotional. This wasn't about rage, it was about balance, about finally tipping the scales after years of carrying everything alone. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply, already seeing the next steps unfolding with startling clarity. He had played therapist. He had played healer. He had played expert. But tomorrow night, I would play something too. Someone who knew the truth, and who finally had the power to use it. A week later, I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner as if everything were normal. Candlelight, soft music, the table set with the good plates we rarely used. It almost looked romantic. And maybe that's why Eric walked in wearing that hopeful little smile, the kind he used whenever he sensed forgiveness he hadn't earned. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said, loosening his shoulders like the past days hadn't been silently frozen between us. I watched him take his seat, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. If he thought this dinner was reconciliation, he was about to realize how wrong he was. I poured the wine slowly, letting the glass fill as he talked about fresh starts and communicating better, his voice dripping with that familiar, self-soothing delusion. The kind that painted him as the victim of circumstance, never the architect of his own chaos. I nodded along, not out of agreement, but because I wanted to give him enough rope to reveal exactly who he was. The longer he spoke, the clearer it became. He truly believed remorse was optional as long as charm was available. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge anything. He just performed. When he finally paused, waiting for me to join the script he'd rehearsed in his head, I offered him the softest, smallest smile. The kind that steadies a person right before the fall. "Oh, we'll rebuild," I said gently, pushing the folder across the table toward him. "Just not together." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering into something darker. He reached for the folder, the candlelight dancing across his fingertips. And in that fragile, almost suspended moment, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years, the certainty that whatever happened next would be mine to control. Eric opened the folder, and I watched the exact second his confidence cracked. His eyes darted across the pages, screenshots, emails, receipts, hotel confirmations, each one slapping the lies right out of him. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost fascinating. "What is this?" he whispered, though he already knew. I leaned back in my chair, letting the softness in my voice cut sharper than any shout ever could. "Your sessions?" I said. "Every single one." He fumbled through the papers, his hands trembling now, not mine. For the first time, he was the one losing control. "You used my home for your scams," I continued, my voice steady, clear. "Pretending to be a therapist without a license? That's a federal offense." His head snapped up, panic flickering across his eyes like a candle fighting to stay lit. "Jessica, you wouldn't—" I raised my hand slightly, stopping him. "I already did." The words hung in the air, heavy and precise. "The state board has everything, and so do the wives of your clients." His breath caught, a choked sound escaping his throat. I could almost see the moment he realized the size of the avalanche he'd triggered, not with one mistake, but with dozens. He slammed his hand on the table, the wine glasses rattling against the plates. "You can't destroy me like this," he blurted, as if he were the victim, as if accountability were cruelty. I held his gaze, unblinking. "I'm not destroying you," I said quietly. "I'm diagnosing you." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged, thick, vibrating with the truth he could no longer outrun. He looked at me like he didn't recognize who I had become. And maybe he didn't. Maybe that was the point, because the woman sitting across from him wasn't the one he had lied to. She was the one who finally knew how to win. He pushed the folder away like it burned, his breath turning shallow, frantic. I could almost see him scrambling through every version of himself, the charmer, the victim, the misunderstood genius, trying to decide which mask might save him now. None of them fit. "Jessica, please," he muttered, voice cracking in a way that might have moved me once. But not tonight. Tonight, his desperation felt like confirmation, proof that he finally understood the consequences weren't theoretical anymore. For the first time, he was the one cornered, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to hold the mirror steady. I stood up slowly, gathering my things with the calm of someone whose storm had already passed. "You built this," I told him, my tone almost gentle. "Every lie, every woman, every pretend session." He shook his head, tears gathering in his eyes, but they felt misplaced, not from remorse, only fear. "What will people think of me?" he whispered. I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "They'll finally think the truth." He clutched the folder, knuckles white, as if gripping it could somehow stop the avalanche already rolling downhill. But accountability doesn't stop because someone panics. As I reached the doorway, I glanced back at him, small, shaking, exposed under the soft glow of candlelight he once thought would set the stage for reconciliation. Instead, it illuminated the ruins of his own creation. "You wanted to play therapist," I said quietly. "Now you'll get a full evaluation, in court." His eyes widened, but I didn't wait for another plea. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight lift off me like a coat I'd finally outgrown. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this dinner was just the beginning, and by the end of the week, his entire world would collapse in front of everyone. The fallout didn't take long. By the end of the week, my phone buzzed nonstop, not with questions for me, but with updates about him. Complaints had already been filed. Investigators were already looking into his practice. Women he'd lied to began realizing they weren't special clients, just pieces in his fantasy of importance. I watched it all unfold with a strange mix of disbelief and calm, like witnessing a storm you once feared but now understand from a safe distance. The truth wasn't trickling out. It was erupting, one headline at a time. I stood on the sidewalk the morning everything became public, surrounded by murmurs and shocked whispers. Neighbors who once smiled politely now stood with folded arms, staring at my house like it had been a stage for something sordid. A local news van pulled up. Reporters rushed out with microphones, chasing a story they could probably smell from blocks away. And then, right there in front of everyone, Eric was escorted out by 2 officers. His hands were cuffed, his jaw clenched, his pride shattered. Watching him stumble in front of flashing cameras felt surreal, like seeing the final scene of a movie I never wanted to star in. He looked up and found me in the crowd. His eyes were wild, pleading, desperate in a way I'd never seen. "Jessica, please," he managed, his voice breaking under the weight of everything he'd lost. I stepped forward just enough for him to hear me, but not enough for him to imagine softness where none remained. "You always said therapy was about connection," I told him quietly. "Now you'll have plenty of time to connect, with your cellmate." The officers led him away, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could finally breathe again. In the days that followed, the chaos around him kept growing, but my own life began to feel strangely quiet. I woke up without tension in my shoulders, without the weight of suspicion or the heaviness of holding everything together alone. The house, once suffocating with secrets, felt like it finally exhaled with me. I started packing boxes, not out of urgency, but out of clarity. Every item I wrapped, every drawer I emptied, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd misplaced somewhere along the years of waiting for him to become someone he never was. Letting go didn't hurt. Holding on had. The calls came too, from investigators wanting statements, from women wanting answers, from lawyers wanting documentation. But for the first time, none of it felt overwhelming. I wasn't cleaning up his mess. I was simply confirming the truth. And it felt liberating to speak plainly, without shrinking, without cushioning his mistakes. The more I told my story, the more I realized how much I had stopped hearing my own voice while trying to amplify his. Now my voice sounded stronger, steadier, almost familiar again. And with each passing day, the silence he left behind became a space I could finally fill with something new. One afternoon, as I carried out the last box, the sunlight hit the front door in a way that made the whole house glow. It didn't feel like a crime scene anymore. It felt like closure. I locked the door for the final time, letting the key rest heavy in my palm before dropping it into the mailbox for the realtor. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Every step forward felt like stepping into a life I had built, not a life I had begged someone else to build with me. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Just the end of the part where I kept myself small. A few weeks later, I found myself settling into a small office downtown. My office, with my name on the door, paid for with money I earned on my own terms. I'd launched a consulting business quietly, almost shyly at first, but clients came faster than I expected. People trusted me, respected me. And every time I sat across from someone seeking guidance, I felt an echo of the life Eric had pretended to have. Only this time the work was real, grounded, ethical, honest. Healing wasn't a performance, it was connection. And it was something I finally knew how to offer without losing myself. One morning, as I stepped out with a folder under my arm, I saw Mrs. Dawson across the street. She waved, that same warm smile she'd had the day everything started. I crossed toward her, feeling lighter than I'd felt in years. "Jessica, dear, I heard about everything," she said gently. "I'm so sorry." I squeezed her hand and smiled, not bitter, not wounded, just free. "Don't be," I told her. "You were right. He helped a lot of women." She blinked nervously, unsure if she'd offended me, but I laughed softly. Just not in the way he planned. And for the first time, the memory didn't sting. Later that afternoon, I walked to my car, sunlight catching on the engagement ring I never expected to wear again. Someone honest, kind, successful, someone who didn't shrink beside my strength but supported it, had found his way into my life. And as I sat behind the wheel, I realized something quietly powerful. The version of me who accepted crumbs was gone. I hadn't just escaped a lie. I had stepped into a life built on truth. But the real healing, the part that mattered most, wasn't in finding someone new. It was in finally finding my way back to myself.